Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. As others are coming in, welcome. It's a delight to have you. Thank you so much, Joel. Tonight is the second installment of the Beloved Community Series, which is part of the Lead Like King project at the Urban Renewal Center. We're delighted tonight to have a good friend and an outstanding scholar who's going to spend time with us, sharing out of her research and also her passion. It is a distinct honor to be in partnership with the First Presbyterian Church of Norfolk. And I see Pastor Valina is here and Pastor Jim Wood will join us soon. But particularly grateful for each one of you who has joined us tonight. The purpose of this series is to begin imagining what does a future look like when all of God's people work together toward a more conciliatory future. And so with that question in mind, Dr. Diane Chandler has joined us tonight as our guest lecturer. We have our third installment of this series next Thursday night with Dr. Jamal Dominique Hopkins from Allen University. So Diane Chandler serves as an associate professor of Christian formation and leadership in the Regent University School of Divinity in Virginia Beach, Virginia. She holds a Ph.D. in organizational leadership, a Master of Divinity degree, and a master's degree in education. Diane speaks and publishes widely on themes focusing on Christian spirituality and leadership, and most recently on African American spirituality and the intersection of spiritual formation and race. Along with her husband, Doug, who is with us tonight, Diane attends New Life Church, a multi-ethnic church in the Tidewater, Virginia area. With that said, I want to give Dr. Chandler as much time as possible. Dr. Chandler, it's in your hands.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. I am blessed to be with you all tonight. I also want to thank Pastor Wood, Senior Pastor of First Pres, for his excellent presentation last week on the biblical view of race. If you haven't had the opportunity to listen to it, I think it's on the YouTube channel for First Pres. I just want to say that as I begin, and I'm going to accompany my talk tonight with a PowerPoint, that we are all on a continuum as it relates to race, in my view. I don't think anybody is an expert in this area of race. We're all learning in some way. And so with that, and as I see various people that are coming in the room, I'm seeing names, I recognize some of you, so thank you for joining tonight. As early as 1956, Dr. King spoke about the beloved community. And this to him was his end goal of nonviolent protest. He said in a speech during a victory rally following the announcement of a favorable US Supreme Court decision desegregating buses and public transportation that we all know happened because of Montgomery. He said this: "The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding, goodwill, that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men." Now, Dr. King did not coin the beloved community. He took that term from someone else many decades earlier, but nevertheless, we attribute that to him. Tonight, I want to talk about, and I'm going to share my screen here. Give me just a moment. I want to talk about spiritual formation, race, racism, and racial reconciliation. So tonight we're going to talk about spiritual formation, race, and justice. I want to share some biblical examples of racial reconciliation from the scriptures, which I think is really important. And then I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about US racial history. Why? Because we cannot solve a problem that we do not understand. And that comes from Michelle Alexander from her book, The New Jim Crow. And then I want to talk about racial reconciliation today. We know from the scriptures, beginning in Genesis 1, that every person is created, is made in the image of and likeness of God. And so because of that, each person is worthy of equal respect and dignity. There is not any one person here, elsewhere, saved or unsaved, that does not deserve that because of our Creator. The scriptures also teach, and I've given you a couple of examples here, God shows no partiality and he accepts no bribes. He does not show favoritism. And we can see that so clearly in Acts 10. I'm going to talk about Acts 10 just in a little bit. We also can, as a starting place, say that the Great Commandment is something that it's a double commandment. It's in the theologians look at it as a double love command, but this applies to each and every one of us as it relates to race. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these. Now we say this so many times. And we have to say, what is divine love? And we know that divine love is self-sacrificial. It is seeing someone else other than ourselves. It is putting someone else over our own needs. And with that in mind, this loving our neighbor as ourselves implicates us, doesn't it, when this comes to the area of race? What's interesting to me is Jesus punctuates this double love command by telling a parable about the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan who sees this person on the road who's been robbed and beaten and takes it upon himself to use his resources to help him become whole, to help him to safety. Goes to the inn, pays for what's needed, and make sure that he's taken care of. I'll talk a little bit later about the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well, and why this is it punctuates this discussion on race and ethnicity. Justice in the Bible connotes being equitable, impartial, and fair. You know, people, when I talk about race, or when I'm talking to members of my church, I'm a member of New Life Church, which is in the Hampton Roads area. And we're a multi-ethnic church. I would say at least 51% of our church is African-American, maybe 45% white, and the other international. But the simple answer is God says a lot about justice in the scriptures. And he speaks always of impartiality, always about fairness, always about equity. So to do justly, from Micah 6:8, means giving people their rights, and what they are due regardless of race or ethnicity, including care and protection. This is what we saw with the Good Samaritan who helped the man that was beaten on the road. In the Old Testament, God is described as a just and righteous God who upholds the disadvantaged. And he specifically speaks about these seven, I have 6 points here, but really there are 7 categories of people: the poor, the oppressed, the weak, the orphan, the widow, the immigrant, and the broken. And I am just so proud of what First Pres and other churches, including my own, New Life, is doing with the NEST program in providing a hospitable environment for those who are homeless during these terrible winter months, taking them in. And we can see that this is exercising justice. And I just think we need to see more of that through our churches. I've done a fair amount of research as it relates to race over the last few years. First of all, personally, because I'm in a multi-ethnic church, number one. Number two, a lot of my background came through being discipled through and in the African-American community. And number three, I just see so much division, as you do too, in our world. It's just my commitment, especially because of my church being multi-ethnic. I work in a seminary where in our master's student population, at least 35 to 40% of our students are African-American. And so it just was incumbent upon me to do something to explore topics like African-American spirituality, the Black church, why we are the way we are as a church body in the US. And I wanted to learn more about our racial history, which, to be perfectly honest, in school growing up, I was not exposed to. So for me, I really dug deep into the literature, African-American authors, white authors to explore this. And a few years ago, I wrote a paper entitled African-American Spirituality Through Another Lens. And I tried to pick up some of the best in terms of contemporary and previous authors. And that got me going. And this goes back to about 2015, 2016, bringing me up to today. So based on my literature review, I define racism as a social dynamic based upon the conscious or unconscious belief in the superiority of one's race over another that is evidenced in the marginalization, rejection, or oppression of others, and through the abuse of influence or power restricting the availability of resources. Or, as Beverly Tatum wrote in Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, it's prejudice plus power. And power comes when those resources can be manipulated or withheld. So how does that intersect with spiritual formation? So if spiritual formation is the process of being conformed into the image of Jesus for the sake of others, then racism is a sin, not only against others, but also against God. Why is that? Well, racism basks in pride. It says, I'm better than you, right? In attitude, I'm better than you. It could be related to gender, ethnicity, whatever, but in racism specifically, it's I'm better than you because of I'm a certain race. It sets one person above another. And God finds pride detestable. We see that through the scriptures, Proverbs 16:5, for an example. Pride undermines grace, and it violates this humility we see Paul speak of in Philippians 2, where he talks about Jesus as the exemplar of our faith and of humility, who humbled himself and became a servant and was obedient even to death, the death on the cross. Therefore, in my view, I see racism as a spiritual formation and discipleship issue. And then I would say maybe a few years ago, I began, as I was steeped in some of the literature, realizing it seldom is found in the literature or in my exposure to spiritual formation authors that racism is termed as such, is termed as a spiritual formation issue. And I thought, why isn't it? Why aren't we talking about unity in the body of Christ, speaking against racism? Why isn't this talked about as a discipleship issue? It should be, and it's a gap. It's a gap in at least many Anglo churches. I would be amiss if I didn't talk about some exemplars from the Bible that show this reconciliation that is so, so important. It's really throughout the scriptures. We see it's especially spoken about in the book of Isaiah, for an example, as Isaiah speaks about the poor and the oppressed. But I want to specifically talk about a few examples from the New Testament, one being Jesus at the well with the Samaritan woman. Now, many of us know the story from John 4 that Jesus is walking, has to return to Jerusalem, and he says, I must go through Samaria. And I'm sure his disciples had to be completely shocked. Why? Because Jews and Samaritans were like oil and water. Why was that? Well, years ago, during the Assyrian captivity in 722 BC, the Assyrian ruler came in, took Jews back to Mesopotamia, but he left the lowly, the poor, and the uneducated Jews in the land. He took the educated ones. And so when the captivity was over, what happened is many of those Jews went back, but when the Jews were taken from Israel to Mesopotamia, the Assyrian king also brought some Mesopotamians and had them in the land of Israel. So when these Jews from the captivity returned, they had found that some of their Jewish relatives and ancestors had intermarried with these Mesopotamians, and they became known as the Samaritans. So when Jesus sees this Samaritan woman and asks her for a drink, it was astounding. She was astounded. And when the disciples came and saw Jesus interacting with the Samaritan woman, they had to be absolutely flabbergasted. The fact that Jesus would ask this woman for a drink using her cup, which she was considered unclean. The cup wasn't considered unclean. And yet Jesus said, as we all know, if you knew who was asking you for a drink, you would receive this living water. And so we see this even by Jesus' demonstration that he is reconciling, and he is in a sense saying that this message of salvation is to go to everyone. He violated the mores of the time gender-wise, culturally, and ethnically. And he was saying everybody should receive the gospel. Everyone should receive salvation. We also see in Acts 10, Peter's reluctance to engage with the Gentiles when the Lord gives him a vision of this white sheet dropped down before him, four corners, and all of these unclean animals were in the sheet. And Peter says, no, I have never eaten anything unclean. And the Lord had to show this vision 3 times. Come on, Peter, kill and eat. And finally, Peter hears this knock on the door, right? Somebody comes. So Cornelius sent he's a Roman centurion, sends his command to bring Peter to him. And Peter has no idea really what's going on. And he reluctantly goes, and he's very flat-footed throughout the entire time. And yet he comes and he interacts with Cornelius and Cornelius's family, and they all come to know the Lord. And what's spectacular about if you read it in Acts 10, is they not only received the Lord, but they all spoke in tongues. And I think the Lord, others in Acts spoke in tongues as well. But in this case, it was in front of Peter who was reluctant, Peter who was the leader in this group of disciples. And I'm sure Peter was the oldest. And that's why he was the leader of the pack. But the beauty was that somehow there was an opening in Peter's own heart. And even though Paul had to challenge him later on when he separated himself from eating with Gentiles, the gospel was breaking through to the non-Jewish community. Then we see Paul in Ephesians 2, 1-10, where Paul speaks about the dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile is broken down. And what's really interesting is in the temple, there was a real dividing wall. Gentiles could go into the temple up to a certain place, but then they were restricted. Paul brought Trophimus into the temple. He didn't go beyond that dividing line, but rumor had it with the various Israelites that Trophimus, this Gentile, was taken into the temple by Paul. And that's the reason Paul was arrested. It catalyzed this furor within the Jewish community. Paul said this, though, for he is our peace, who has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. Why? God's promise was to make one new man out of the two, thus making peace, and in his one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility through one spirit. They were different. They were culturally different, but God wanted to bring these two together as a demonstration, right? That one day this gospel would go forth throughout the whole world. And we see in Revelation 7:9 that God has a plan for every tongue, tribe, and nation, from people from every ethne to be before the throne worshiping. And that just excites me, and I know it excites you as well. I think it's really important to review our racial history. I in no way do that to create pain or to create angst. But because if we don't understand our history, we really can't move beyond it. And I think for many, at least in white churches, in the white community, we have not been adequately exposed to our racial history in the US. So I want to review it, and coming up to, at the end, an opportunity to really talk about how we can address and move forward as a church body. So I want to talk about slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, racial segregation, the civil rights movement, and systemic racism today. Slavery began when Europeans, Brits, others came to the west coast of Africa, captured slaves, and you can see a map here on your screen. And this occurred not just where enslaved persons came to the US, you can see though from the arrow they did, but the majority of enslaved persons were taken to Brazil and the Caribbean. What's interesting, we all know the song Amazing Grace. It's sung in Anglo churches, international churches, Black churches. The song Amazing Grace was written by John Newton. And John Newton was a slave trader. He was a captain of a slave ship. You may know the story. He had this deep transformation. He was a womanizer. He drank alcohol quite a bit. Maybe he was an alcoholic. But someone gave him a copy of Thomas à Kempis's book, The Imitation of Christ. And when he read it, he was really, really convicted. He was so convicted that soon after that, during a storm that threatened the ship, threatened everybody, Newton repented. And as a result, left the slave trade and became a clergyman, an Anglican clergyman, and worked with Wilberforce in England to overturn slavery, which he did, and he helped successfully. The Middle Passage was brutal. There is no way to say it. Locked in, no opportunity to relieve oneself. Many suffocated, many tried to commit suicide, many jumped overboard, and many lives were lost. There were 12.5 million enslaved people that were brought into North and South America. Of those 12.5, 1.8 million died en route. And we can see why. In history, it's been said that the first enslaved people came to this area, which is in Hampton Roads, in 1619. However, Henry Louis Gates Jr. would contradict that. He would say maybe 1619 was the time when the first enslaved came to the area of Fort Monroe, which is about 33 miles from where I live. But he would say that this happened almost a century earlier in South America. And also when Ponce de Leon, the Spanish explorer, came, he landed in Florida, there was one African that was with him. And he ended up moving to Mexico and going into business. He had a business, actually. When the enslaved came, they helped on plantations, farms, primarily cotton, tobacco, and they were often, when they arrived here, they were traded for farms. But what's so alarming to me is they were traded oftentimes for food. They were maybe bought and sold for $5 to $10 back in those days. By the middle of the 1800s, able-bodied Africans could be bought and sold for $1,200 to $1,500. While the slave trade was outlawed in 1807, chattel slavery continued. That is where a mother and father had children. The children remained on the plantation. When they grew up, they married, they had children. In other words, a whole line of individuals remain enslaved. So in this sense, slavery turned people from subjects into objects. What ended up happening oftentimes is that the enslaved were invited to come to church with white Christians, but they were relegated to maybe a loft or back rows. However, something stuck. They began to hear the scriptures. And when they did, they developed, in a sense, they brought over some of the spiritual practices from Africa. And many of them were pagan, but they developed a worship style, and even preachers rose from those hush harbors and backfields. They clung to stories like the Exodus, where Israelites were under bondage by the Egyptians, and God freed them. Black church historian Albert Rabateau said, in the US, the gods of Africa died. It's very interesting because some of the Africans that arrived in places like Haiti and other places, they were not as exposed to the gospel, perhaps, and retained a lot of the African spiritual practices that they engaged in when they were back home. One way that whites had helped to control the narrative is they produced slave Bibles, and they distributed those. 90% of the Old Testament and 50% of the New Testament was omitted, including Moses leading his people from bondage into the promised land. It's just amazing. And yet these slavery advocates, these white slave owners would say as a rebuttal, but slavery is in the Bible. But they didn't understand that the slavery that they were referring to, that we saw in perhaps the Old and New Testament, was clearly different from the slavery that was happening in the 17th, 18th centuries. This brings us up to the Civil War. The Civil War was the culmination between the northern and southern states, and it was the hub of large farms. The North's economy was manufacturing and industry. We see eventually the Civil War brought about Abraham Lincoln's proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation, where he, in theory, said that all those that were enslaved became free. Well, we know that didn't necessarily happen right at that time. In the Civil War, there were many casualties, 2.4 million total soldiers, 620,000 men died. 186 Black soldiers joined the Union. 38,000 died fighting the Civil War. At the start of the Civil War, the South provided 75% of the world's cotton. Southern plantation owners feared the demise of their economy without enslaved people to work their farms. The 11 Confederate states wanted the newly expanded territories to support slavery. So what happened was when these regions, particularly in the South, began exploring in the Midwest, and they were moving out to California, they wanted all of those new territories to include slavery. At the end of the war, 4 million enslaved persons were free. However, we can see various amendments helped to nurture freedoms. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment ensured citizenship to all people born and naturalized in the US. The 15th Amendment in 1870 granted Black men, not women, the right to vote, but whites thwarted voting by applying poll taxes and literacy tests, right? So enslaved people were not allowed to read, although some did learn to read on their own, and some, usually perhaps a white slave owner's wife might teach one or two enslaved people how to read. So in Reconstruction, this period after the Civil War, there was the Freedmen's Bureau that was established. It was an act of Congress to assist newly freed people with food, housing, medical aid, and schooling. However, President Andrew Johnson thwarted its implementation and opposed citizenship for former slaves. White Southerners also strongly opposed this. Why? Right? They gave up some of their land, but the land that they did retain, they somehow made sure that some of those that worked on their land still became enslaved. The act, this Freedmen's Bureau Act, was underfunded and understaffed. However, some hospitals were built, people were fed, and some schools were established. We can say Howard, Fisk, and Hampton universities were a result of that. Sadly, under Reconstruction, we can see the emergence of the KKK beginning in the 1870s and 1880s. This was this terrible white supremacist backlash that continued through the 1920s, 1930s, through the Civil Rights era, and we see remnants of it today. It was founded actually in 1865 in Tennessee by a group of Confederate soldiers. No surprises there. The travesty is that many KKK members were Protestant Christians, with an estimated 40,000 of them being white ministers. Then following the Civil War and through Reconstruction, we can see these Jim Crow laws that emerged. These were state and local laws that enforced segregation in schools, public places, and public transportation. One wonderful bright spot was what happened at Azusa Street in Los Angeles. William J. Seymour was a holiness preacher, and he was the son of enslaved parents in Louisiana. He became the leader of the Azusa Street revival. Those from various denominations, white, Black, came together, Quakers, Baptists, Presbyterians, for joint worship, and just this revival spread in our country, and it actually went overseas as well. And it was said through Seymour's revival that the color line was washed away in the blood. It was such a moving, amazing time of God in our country. And as a result, now there are over 500 million Pentecostals worldwide. I'm going to have to go very quickly through some of the other things I have here. We can see in 1954 in the Topeka Board of Education versus Brown that there was a striking down of separate but equal schools. Civil rights movement, where we see Emmett Till, his death was probably a real catalyst for the civil rights movement, moved it on. He was killed in the South in Montgomery, Alabama, falsely accused. The woman that accused him of lewd advances actually recanted that years later when her husband died. Rosa Parks, the civil rights movement. She was, if we could say Emmett Till catalyzed it somewhat, fueled it, it was really Rosa Parks that first began it. She refused to give up her seat on the bus. Martin Luther King's arrest in Birmingham, demanding an amazing, and we all, I would hope, have been exposed to the letter that he wrote from the Birmingham jail. Lots of violent backlash from police. There were many, many positive outcomes to the civil rights movement, and I've listed many of them here. It's a crime to prevent someone from voting, equal opportunity for all, a banning of literacy tests and poll taxes, and then the Housing Act of 1968 preventing housing discrimination based on race, gender, national origin, and religion. But we pull up now to the last few years and we can see this collective trauma and inequality that has emerged. So even with legislation, right, we still have such a long, long, long ways to go. Bishop Claude Alexander, senior pastor of the Park Church, has said an undealt with past becomes present. And indeed it does. And I think this is my sense, is that in our country, even though we have legislation, we have not really, as a country, repented. There are pockets of repentance. There are pockets. Some denominations have repented. We can see what happened at the Miracle of Memphis, where there was a coming together of white and Black Pentecostals to ask forgiveness. But racism in our country is a stronghold, and it will not go easily. What will it take for our nation to really experience equity and deference to one another? And I'm coming to the last 5 minutes of my presentation here. I'd like to suggest, and I'm going to borrow from Jemar Tisby's work, How to Fight Racism. Jemar Tisby presents what he calls an ARC approach, a threefold approach for how to find ourselves in a place where we can grow and be able to find hope in our continuing along. What does he say? He says the first thing is we have to have an awareness. We have to build awareness. Now, Jemar Tisby also is speaking, I think, in this book and his previous book, The Color of Compromise, he's speaking somewhat to a white audience. So I would say to my white brothers and sisters that one way that we can learn more and to become more aware is to listen and to learn. And how do we do that? We read. One of the books that I'm very excited about, and I just have to show it, and that's Antipas Harris's book, that is Christianity, the White Man's Religion. It just came out within the last year, an excellent book that you need to read. But we need to build awareness, a sensitivity, and from there, we need to lament and we need to repent, to really see our history and say, this has happened in our country, and what are we going to do about it? The very first step is to learn and to listen, especially to our Black brothers and sisters, to be willing to reach out to them when things happen and to hear about their experience. And then Tisby talks about relationships, that we can build relationships with those that are different from ourselves. My husband is the global outreach pastor of our church, and he equips our body in cross-cultural communication. He assists train our folk to go on short-term trips overseas in many different areas of the world. And one thing I have learned from him is the power of cross-cultural communication in building relationships, especially with those who are different from ourselves and have a different culture. So if awareness is the head, relationships connote to the heart. And then Tisby talks about commitment. That's the hands. What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And he offers many suggestions. And maybe we can talk about some of them in the Q&A period. But one way is that we can activate this is to be a part of something like the Urban Outreach Center, like doing something in our church to educate our church members about the power of reconciliation, or as some would say, the power of conciliation, because reconciliation means we've been forged in unity previously, and some would commit to that not being the case. The one way we're going to arrive at this arc, awareness, the head, relationships, the heart, commitment, the hands, is if we operate in godly love. And in godly love, forgiveness has to be a part of the equation, but we can't often forgive what's not repented of. And so I would like to suggest that as churches, we take this seriously and find ourselves at a place where we can lead, maybe in localities, starting with our local churches, a commission of churches in a locale, and do the hard work of repentance and reconciliation. Now, in my PowerPoint, I don't expect you to, I do offer some resources here. Maybe what I can do, Joel, is I can send some of these resources to you, and you can make these available to folks so that they could take a photograph with their phones for more reading and to educate ourselves further. So I commend to you how I started, and that is that we would love the Lord with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and we would love our neighbor as ourselves. We can't do that in our own strength. We need the grace of God. But that we would go forward committing, God, that I would think seriously about how I can apply this ARC approach to my own life. What is the next step for me? Because each one and every one of us is on a continuum. How can I move one step further in this regard? And so with that, I just want to close and open things up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Chandler. This has been an amazing presentation. And so with that, I would love to share some questions with you from everyone who's tuned in this evening. So in order to be able to get to as many thoughts and discussion points as possible, I ask that if you have a question for Dr. Chandler, please post it in the chat. If you're on a laptop, that's on the bottom bar. If you're on a phone or an iPad, depending on your device, you may have to swipe and move around a little bit, but be bold, be brave, and search for the chat. And share your questions with us, and I'll pose them to Dr. Chandler. And while you're searching for the chat function and sharing those with us, Dr. Chandler, I'd like to kick it off and maybe ask you to share just a few thoughts. I really love the way that you said racism is a spiritual formation, a discipleship issue. And so I was just wondering if you'd be willing to share a few thoughts, maybe even practical things on how to get at that issue on an individual spiritual formation platform as church leaders, which I see many pastors and church leaders on the call. So as a leadership, as we shepherd our people, and then also just on a larger scale as the whole church addressing spiritual formation and the issue of racism in that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some simple things that can happen. Excuse me. I think there's some simple things that can happen and easy things that can happen. And that is that these things pastors can preach on topics like Acts 10, like the Acts narrative with the Ethiopian eunuch. You know, it's conceivable that the very first convert in the New Testament was a black North African, an Ethiopian, that we can help our people understand scripture. So unless we see a view, right? I see through a set of lenses, but unless we see through a biblical lens, we can't just look at sociology. We can't just look at our history. We have to look from a biblical lens. Racial reconciliation is everywhere in the Bible. I think we should be teaching more about it. We should lay the foundation, number one, from the pulpit. Number two, I think it should be a part of, many churches have new discipleship classes. I think it should be a part of a new discipleship class. If a class is if a church is 100% Black or 100% white, or it's a multi-ethnic church like I'm a part of, I think it needs to be in every range of churches where we can talk about these things and help people understand, particularly in the US, our history. You can't talk about racial reconciliation without looking at history. And I can say, as an Anglo, many Anglos, we know it to an extent, but we need to dig deeper and understand. That's why we can lament. We can say, this is our history and we want to do something about it. And how do we do something about it? And I see David said to everyone, Tony Evans, Oneness Embraced. I'm in the chat. Yes, and that's one of the resources that I have in the resources at the end of my PowerPoint. So teaching, we can also, churches can collaborate with other churches that are not of the same ethnicity, partner in something in a community endeavor. Those are just off the top of my head, just a few suggestions. Oh, and some other things that churches can do: book reads, right? You can have a book club, read a book, read Dr. Harris's book together and talk about it. Read The Color of Compromise, which talks about our racial history in the US. There's so many books. Read Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, any number of great resources.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah, leadership with intentionality, right?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. And so, as you said, David recommends Dr. Tony Evans' Oneness Embraced. I'll pause for a moment. The Urban Renewal Center website, I'll see if we can get this recording posted, but also if we can get that book list recommendation out somehow. I think that would be a great way to share that for sure. We do have another question in the chat. How do you approach a pastor who has not or does not speak on the topic of racism?
Yeah. Well, if you're in a, I'm going to answer that question in a few ways. I think that's an easy topic in a Black church. In a white church, a pastor has to be prepared for some kickback, or in a multi-ethnic church, if the senior leader is white, need to be prepared for a little bit of pushback, right? Because it's going to push some buttons. But I think that maybe broaching the topic with one's pastor in a non-confrontive manner is one place to start, and be prayerful. I find that you're always going to get pushback if you go and accuse someone of being a racist. If we're about, now, are some things racist in our culture? Most definitely. But if we're trying to move someone on that pendulum, right, we're all on a different place on our journey, then I think we need to deal with things tenderly. So that's not easy if a pastor is closed, but I think it's worth a conversation and worth being suggestive and worth praying for the pastor.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's great. We do have, so there's no questions in the chat. I do have one person has their hand raised, so perhaps they're unable to find the chat. So I'm going to invite Mr. Bland to go ahead and unmute and share your question with us.
Hi, this is Gil Bland, and I'm a member of FTC and also the President and CEO of the Urban League of Hampton Roads. We are an affiliate of the oldest civil rights organization in the country. And my question is this: over the past 4 years, the political chatter, in my opinion, has been both anti-Semitic as well as racist. And again, my perception is that the evangelical leaders in the country have kind of implicitly embraced that message and very overtly embraced the messenger. And my question is this: you being in higher ed and in a seminary, and for anybody else on the line who's involved in religious education, is this being discussed with impressionable young pastors, ministers, missionaries who are going out into the field? I mean, is there any real active debate, or is it just implicit acceptance that it's okay to be silent?
And I'm sorry I don't know you, but thank you for your question. You know, 81% of white evangelicals did vote the Republican Party. And I think the important thing to note is there is a lot of chatter. And there's a lot of chatter within that 81%, and there's a lot of chatter outside of that 81%. And there's some chatter in that 81% that is bailing out of it. To your question, I can't tell you, you know, I'm working from home these days. I rarely go into my office because of COVID, but I have lots of conversations with people about what you've just expressed. In my view, there is a big difference between someone who says they're a Christian and someone who acts Christianly, right? I don't care who they are. I don't care what platform they're on. I don't care what party they're on. I have to look at someone's behavior. We know them by their fruit. So I cannot, you know, I can't speak into the 81% that would justify that vote. I don't begin to understand it fully. However, this remains, and I'm sure there will be more people that are much more equipped than I am to understand and tease out the sociological and the spiritual underpinnings of that. And just let me say, I think that 81% white evangelical, we all know they would take a pro-life, anti-abortion stance. What troubles me about the issues of pro-life social justice is that they are looked at as two opposite ends and as enemies in the spectrum of Christianity. As though I'm pro-life, I'm anti-abortion, and I make no apologies for that. But I'm also an advocate for social justice. Why? Because they are two wings of the same bird. They are both under the umbrella of God's justice, God's mercy, God's love, and the Imago Dei. So it's a travesty, and I think it's a strategy of the enemy to keep the church that supports social justice as a main platform, and the church that supports pro-life, anti-abortion as its main platform, to keep us at odds. It's a violation of God's character. So I'm in a lot of conversations, and I can just speak personally. I'm in a lot of conversations about these things, and those in higher education at other universities.
But Mike, let me ask you this, just to narrow it a bit, because you know I don't want to try to boil the ocean with why people do what they do, but I mean generally higher ed is to help shape young minds, the future workforce, the future academicians, et cetera. I mean, does that occur in the seminary, or do people come with predetermined positions and they're just left to themselves? And then the second part of that is, you spoke of Jim Crow laws. I mean, what's occurring in at least 30 states now to roll back voting access? to me is akin to some of the same issues that we faced in 1954.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's a deafening silence by church leaders and those in religious schools to what's going on. I mean, whether we like it or not, the demographics of this country are shifting.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I know that makes people angry, but it's a reality.
No,
It's a truth that's not going to stop.
that's right. To your first question, I will tell you what I do as a professor. Wherever I can, I'm talking about, you know, personally with students, or I don't teach a class, although I would love to teach a class, co-teach a class. Maybe I could do something with Antipas Harris one day, where to teach a class on African American spirituality. And because it thrusts you into the history of our country, and you have to deal with these issues. I'm not prepared to say or to disparage right now any candidate, at least not publicly, or person in office. But I can tell you, back to my original statement, when I am engaged as a professor by students, I am very honest about these issues and where I stand. I make no apology. Do all of my colleagues agree with me? Probably not. But wherever I can, I try to insert this idea that we're all ambassadors for Christ, that racial reconciliation, and to your point, I don't think that everybody that comes into Regent University, which is where I work in the seminary, you know, obviously they're all over the place. I think politically, culturally, and yet I find within my classes, you know, great synergy. It's a little bit harder to do that online, right? Because we're not face to face. You see people's expressions, you see body language, you can get together and chat after class. You know, 95% of our students at Regent in the School of Divinity are online. But I do hear your point. And I think in that arc that I was talking about earlier, that commitment piece, what we can do is we can use our pocketbooks, we can use our vote, we can use our voice to speak up as it relates to fighting and standing against racism and systemic racism.
Well, Dr. Chandler, thank you for that this evening. And on behalf of everyone on this call, thank you for leading us in this discussion tonight. This was great. It is just after 8, so I want to honor everybody's time. So thank you for being with us. And also, I'm also excited that the discussion of beloved community will continue with a few more sessions over the coming weeks. Next Thursday, March 11th, Jamal Dominique Hopkins will lead us in the discussion of King's Dream of the Beloved Community, Cross-Racial Cultural Formation, and the Cultural Church. This session was recorded as well and will be available in the coming days through the Urban Renewal Center and First Presbyterian outlets. So feel free to share. And once again, Dr. Chandler and Dr. Harris, thank you both for leading us this evening. This was great.
Thank you so much for the invitation. God bless you all.
Good night, everybody.